You will hear this story for the first time only in this video. Do not forget to write your comments about the story. Have a good listen. Emma and Jake's argument had been brewing for hours, a simmering pot of grievances that finally boiled over just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The tension was palpable inside their cramped car, the silence only broken by the rhythmic clatter of the engine and the occasional sharp retort. As they wound through the dense forest, the road seemed to narrow, the trees pressing in on either side like silent sentinels. Emma's eyes, fixed on the road ahead, were red-rimmed from suppressed tears. Jake's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched in frustration. Neither noticed the shadow that flickered across the road until it was too late. With a sudden swerve, the car veered off the pavement, crashing into a gnarled old tree with a sickening crunch. The airbag exploded in Emma's face, dazing her momentarily. Jake's head slammed into the steering wheel, leaving him momentarily stunned. For a few heartbeats, the world was a cacophony of crickets and the hissing of the engine. They both sat in shocked silence, hearts pounding, trying to process what had just happened. Emma was the first to stir, fumbling with her seatbelt and pushing open the mangled door. She stumbled out into the cool night air, the forest around them eerily quiet. Jake followed suit, wincing as he put weight on his left leg. "Are you okay?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. Jake nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure. They were both bruised and shaken, but miraculously unscathed. With no cell reception, and the realization that they hadn't seen another car or house for miles, the couple decided to seek help on foot. They gathered a few essentials from the wrecked car, Emma's backpack, a flashlight, and a half-full bottle of water, and set off down an overgrown path that seemed to lead deeper into the woods. The trees loomed overhead, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The path was narrow and uneven, making their progress slow and cautious. Strange symbols carved into the bark of the trees caught their eyes. They were intricate and alien, unlike anything they had seen before. As they walked, the forest seemed to close in around them, the shadows deepening and the air growing colder. The wind whispered through the leaves, carrying with it voices that seemed just out of reach, murmuring in a language neither of them recognized. Emma shivered and pulled her jacket tighter around her. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The feeling of being watched was becoming unbearable, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on them with every step they took. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. It was impossible to tell in the disorienting twilight of the forest. They stumbled upon an old, abandoned village, the buildings dilapidated and overgrown with ivy. A sense of foreboding hung heavy in the air, as if the village itself was holding its breath. Desperation drove them to enter one of the houses, hoping to find some clue or means of communication. The door creaked open to reveal a surprisingly intact interior. Lit candles cast flickering shadows on the walls, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh food. On a dusty mantelpiece, they found photographs of a family that eerily resembled them. The photographs sent a chill down Emma's spine. The faces in the pictures were familiar, yet not quite right. It was as if they were looking at distorted reflections of themselves. They explored further, finding more unsettling signs of recent habitation. The house seemed to be frozen in time, every detail meticulously preserved. In the kitchen, a pot of stew simmered on the stove, and the table was set for dinner. Emma and Jake exchanged uneasy glances. "We need to leave," Jake said, his voice tight with anxiety. But as they turned to go, the door slammed shut with a resounding bang, plunging the room into darkness. Panic set in as they fumbled to reopen the door, but it was as if the house had come alive, trapping them inside. The windows were boarded up and the walls seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. In their frantic search for an exit, they stumbled upon a hidden door leading to the basement. With no other options, they descended the creaking stairs into the musty gloom below. The basement was a labyrinth of corridors and rooms, each filled with relics of the past, rusty tools, broken furniture, and old books. It was there they encountered the mysterious figure cloaked in shadows. The figure's presence was overwhelming, a tangible darkness that seemed to suck the light from the room. "You should not be here," it whispered. its voice a gravelly rasp that sent shivers down their spines. "This village is cursed. You are not the first, nor will you be the last." Emma and Jake backed away slowly, but the figure advanced, its form shifting and flickering like smoke. It extended a hand pointing towards a dusty old journal lying on a table. "Read," it commanded. "Only then will you understand." With trembling hands, Emma picked up the journal and opened it to the first page. The entries were written in a hurried scrawl, detailing the experiences of someone who had been trapped in the village years ago. The author described the village as a purgatory, a place that fed on the despair and fear of those who entered. The only way to escape, they wrote, was to confront their darkest fears and make a sacrifice. Emma read aloud, her voice trembling with each word. As she did, the figure receded into the shadows, leaving them alone in the dimly lit basement. Armed with the knowledge from the journal, Emma and Jake steeled themselves for what lay ahead. They climbed the stairs back to the main floor, finding the house strangely quiet and still. The door was now unlocked, swinging open with an eerie creak. Outside, the village seemed different, the buildings more twisted and grotesque. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and the shadows seemed to writhe and pulse with a life of their own. They knew they had to confront their fears, but the prospect was terrifying. Emma's darkest fear was rooted in a traumatic event from her childhood. When she was 10, she had witnessed her younger brother drown while they were playing near a river. The guilt and sorrow had haunted her ever since, manifesting in nightmares and bouts of depression. As they walked through the village, she began to hear the sound of rushing water and childish laughter. She turned to see a spectral vision of her brother, his eyes wide with terror, reaching out to her from the shadows. The sight was too much to bear, and she fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Jake's fear was equally profound, stemming from his estranged relationship with his father. Growing up, Jake had endured years of emotional and physical abuse before finally cutting ties and leaving home. As they moved through the village, he began to hear his father's voice, berating and belittling him as he had done so many times before. The voice grew louder and more insistent, echoing through the empty streets. Jake tried to block it out, but the memories flooded back with relentless force, threatening to overwhelm him. Together, they faced their fears, supporting each other through the torment. Emma relived the traumatic day of her brother's death, confronting the guilt that had plagued her for so long. She reached out to the spectral vision, apologizing and asking for forgiveness. The apparition smiled sadly before dissipating into the mist. Jake, too, confronted his past, standing up to the phantom of his father and rejecting the hold the abuse had over him. The village seemed to react to their resolve, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly as they conquered their personal demons. But the village was not done with them yet. As they regrouped, they heard a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from all directions. The ground beneath their feet began to shake, and the buildings around them creaked and groaned as if alive. The shadowy figure reappeared, its form more defined and menacing than before. "You have faced your fears," it intoned, "but the sacrifice remains." The ground split open, revealing a chasm filled with darkness. The figure pointed towards the chasm, its meaning clear. Emma and Jake exchanged a look of pure terror. The journal had mentioned a sacrifice, but they had hoped it wouldn't come to this. The chasm seemed to beckon them, a void that promised both oblivion and release. They realized that their love for each other was the ultimate sacrifice. Their bond was what the village sought to sever. Holding hands, they approached the edge of the chasm, their hearts heavy with the weight of their decision. They had come this far together, and they would face the end together as well. As they stood on the brink, the shadowy figure raised its hands, and the village began to crumble around them. The ground shook violently, and the buildings collapsed into piles of rubble. Emma and Jake closed their eyes, preparing to leap into the darkness, but as they did, a blinding light enveloped them, pulling them back from the edge. The light grew brighter and warmer, dispelling the shadows and filling them with a sense of peace. They opened their eyes to find themselves back at the crash site, the forest bathed in the soft light of dawn. They lay on the ground, bruised and battered but alive. The car was still there, wrapped around the tree, but the malevolent energy was gone. Emma and Jake looked at each other, tears streaming down their faces. They had faced their darkest fears and made the ultimate sacrifice, only to be given a second chance. They climbed to their feet, helping each other as they walked back to the road. The forest seemed different now, less oppressive and more welcoming. They felt a sense of closure and relief, knowing that they had overcome the horrors of the village. As they reached the road, they saw a car approaching in the distance. They waved it down, and the driver, a kindly older man, offered to take them to the nearest town. As they drove away, Emma and Jake held hands, silently vowing never to speak of the ordeal they had endured. The experience had changed them, bringing them closer together and giving them a newfound appreciation for each other. They knew they would carry the memories of the village with them forever, but they were determined to move forward and leave the past behind. Days turned into weeks, and life slowly returned to normal. Emma and Jake moved into a new apartment, far away from the forest and its haunted village. They focused on rebuilding their lives, finding solace in each other's company. But the memories of the village lingered, surfacing in their dreams and in quiet moments of reflection. They sought therapy, talking through their experiences and working to heal the emotional wounds. Their bond grew stronger, forged in the crucible of their shared trauma. Despite their best efforts, there were times when the shadows of the past crept back into their lives. Emma found herself drawn to the forest, unable to shake the feeling that something was left unresolved. She began researching the area, uncovering old legends and stories about the cursed village. She discovered that others had reported similar experiences, though few had survived to tell the tale. The stories spoke of a guardian, a malevolent spirit that trapped souls and fed on their fears. Jake, too, was haunted by the village. He often woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat and gasping for breath. The phantom voice of his father still echoed in his mind, a reminder of the pain he had endured. He threw himself into his work, trying to keep the demons at bay, but the shadows were always there, lurking just beneath the surface. He and Emma talked about their experiences, finding comfort in their shared understanding. They knew they were not alone in their struggle. One evening, as they sat on their balcony watching the sunset, Emma turned to Jake with a determined look in her eyes. "We need to go back," she said. Jake stared at her in disbelief. "Why would we do that?" he asked. Emma explained that she felt they had unfinished business in the village. They had faced their fears and made a sacrifice, but she believed there was more to the story. She was convinced that the village held secrets that needed to be uncovered, and she wanted to ensure that no one else would fall into its trap. Reluctantly, Jake agreed to return. They prepared carefully, packing supplies and making sure they had a plan. This time, they would be ready for whatever the village threw at them. As they drove back to the forest, a sense of dread settled over them. The road was just as they remembered, winding and narrow, with the trees pressing in on either side. They parked the car and set off on foot, following the same overgrown path they had taken before. The forest was silent, the air thick with anticipation. When they reached the village, it was as if nothing had changed. The buildings were still dilapidated, and the air was heavy with foreboding. They entered the house where they had found the journal, hoping to find more clues. As they searched, they discovered a hidden compartment in the floor, revealing a collection of old documents and artifacts. Among them was a map of the village, marked with symbols and annotations. The map detailed a ritual that could break the curse and free the trapped souls. With newfound resolve, Emma and Jake set about performing the ritual. They gathered the necessary items and followed the instructions meticulously. As they completed the final step, a powerful energy surged through the village. The ground shook and the buildings crumbled into dust. The shadowy figure appeared one last time, its form dissolving into the light. The village was finally free, the curse broken. Emma and Jake stood together, watching as the spirits of the trapped souls ascended into the sky. They had done it. They had freed the village and ensured that no one else would suffer the same fate. As they walked back to their car, they felt a sense of peace and closure, knowing they had finally put the past to rest. To hear more suspenseful and chilling stories like this one, please consider supporting my channel by subscribing and liking the video. Your support means a lot to me. Thank you!